certain extent in machines. And as is the case with cognitive scientists, you basically put your hand on any methodology that can help understanding how human brain works and certain cognitive processes work. And in that sense, I think there's a lot of overlap between computational linguistics, computational cognitive science, and computational neuroscience. So even though we are using different kinds of methodologies and we are looking at different levels of granularity when we look at human brain and its functions, the ultimate goal is to understand how we perform, how we learn and perform certain cognitive processes. I'm going to try to share my slides with you. We will see how it works. I get an error message. Do I have the permission to share my slides?
I think so.
We tried this last week and it worked, but now when I try to share my entire screen, it doesn't work. No, it doesn't work. Let me see if I can upload my file here. Sorry for the delay.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Actually, there is no need to upload your file. You can simply click on the share screen icon, and you can share your presentation with the crowd.
Well, I don't see it here. That's the thing.
I believe the icon is of a desktop or a monitor or something like that.
So what I see is this اشتراک گذاری صفحه.
Yeah, exactly.
When I click on that, I see Chrome tab, window, or entire screen.
Please share your entire screen so that we can see it in presenting you.
So when I do that, it says اشتراک صفحه با خطا روبرو شد. اطلاعات بیشتر.
I believe it's because of the internet connection. Maybe you can change your browser. Are you logging in using Safari?
No, I'm using Chrome. We actually tested this to make sure that it works. Do you want me to get out and come back in? Do you think it would?
Yeah, I would appreciate if you did that.
No problem. Okay, we're going to try again.
Can you share your screen right now?
I'm trying. Oh, yay. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So can you see my slide?
I think it's coming. Just a moment. Yes. Yeah. We can. Yeah. We have the slides. Yeah.
All right. So let's start. So, as I said, the central research question that I'm interested in is to understand better how humans learn language. And when I say humans, of course, adults also learn language, but in the course of this talk, I'm going to focus on the case of children. So, we are talking about a young language learner who is trying to figure out this complex communication system based on the data that they receive from their environment, right? Now, coming from a computer science background, my methodology of choice would be to try to simulate this process and see what we learn during this simulation. So, trying to basically study the environment in which a child learns language and try to see if we can simulate language learning in an experimental environment which is as close to the naturalistic setting as we can potentially. Of course, when we do modeling, we are always simplifying things, but we are going to see how far we can go, right? That's the ultimate goal. Now, this process of modeling language learning or language processing in general has a very long history in cognitive science. So this is not something that is recent. You probably have all seen some simple or more complex models of language. Nowadays, we know a lot of applied models that are very human-like. So, there is no uh, question anymore that computers can learn to produce and to understand language at a very human-like level. Um, but the focus of my talk and in general computational cognitive science is to do things hopefully the way humans do it, right? And the ultimate goal is to use these models to understand better the underlying mechanisms that account for learning language. So we are not really focusing on building the most powerful model. We are uh, aiming for something that's as plausible and as similar to humans as possible. So, how did this usually happen in the past and to a large extent in the future? If a computational cognitive scientist wants to simulate language learning in humans, they usually build a computational model based on some hypotheses and some pre assumptions, right? So, it could be that we have some linguistic theories that tell us how humans process certain type of language data. It could be that we have some empirical evidence coming from psycholinguistics, for example, how humans actually process language. So we try to build a formal model on top of what we think is happening. And once we have a model, this could be a very simple model, this could be a more complex model, it could be focused on a certain aspect of learning a language. But the bottom line is that in order to train our model, we need some sort of a sequence of linguistic data, right? Language input, so to speak. So this is not usually a major challenge. It was in the past because large collections of linguistic data were not very easy to find, but obviously these days we don't really have that problem. So we have a corpus of, let's say, sentences, and we feed these corpus to our model, and this model uses some sort of a learning algorithm to induce a certain type of linguistic knowledge. It could be some information about what the meanings of the words are in it, could be some sort of a representation of the grammar of the language. It all depends on the ultimate focus and goal of your model. At this point, we probably want to know how well our model is doing, right? So once we have some sort of a learned linguistic knowledge, we have to evaluate our model and see how close it is to what we think humans are. In the past, and when I say past, I'm really not talking about 100 years ago. I'm even, referring to some as recent as like 10 years ago. The classic approach was to rely on annotations that we get from human experts. So, what do I mean by that? For example, let's say our focus is on learning the grammatical structure of the language that the model is trying to learn, right? So what we used to do was to ask some linguists to sit down and analyze and parse every single sentence in this data set. And ultimately, where our model try to do the same kind of analysis, we would compare the learned linguistic information with the gold linguistic knowledge. By gold, I mean the ultimate goal that we want our model to achieve. Or for example, if we are focused on learning the meanings of individual words, then we have some sort of a ultimate lexicon, which tells us what the gold meaning of each word is. And then we simply need to compare the learned meanings for words as induced by the model to the gold ones as defined by experts. And so in that sense, it's a very straightforward procedure, right? Now, I want you to try to think about a human child, let's say, who is learning language according to this general scheme. So we are talking about a learner who listens to, or in this case, actually reads sentences that are coming to them without interacting with the environment in any way, right? So this is a passive learner who is sitting in the corner of the room, listening or reading sentences as they come and trying to learn something about the complex system behind these single items. So in a way, this is the child that we are trying to simulate, right? With the eyes closed, listening to language and not doing anything. I don't know how many of you have interactions with children on a daily basis. I'm sure, some of you have kids or are around kids, but even if you don't, I'm sure you would agree with me that this is too simplistic an image. This is too nice and clean and tidy for a real child to be realistic in any way. So what is missing here? Well, a lot is missing here, but perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is the very noisy visual and perceptual environment in which a child is actually interacting and processing language at the same time, right? So not only is this environment very noisy and ambiguous and messy, it also contains a lot more information that the classical language learning models assumed. For example, if you hear a sentence, tu penarengi, I assume there are some people in the audience who don't understand Farsi, and that's good because then you can sympathize with this young child who is trying to learn this language that they really don't know much about. But if there is this pre-assumption that whatever they hear has something to do with what is around them, then it could be that some of the objects around them is actually holding the key to the meaning of this phrase, right? So that it could be that this phrase is referring to part of this perceptual context that the child is observing. Okay, so how do we change our setting? We don't have to do much. The only change that we really need to apply here is to not only have a sequence of sentences, written or spoken utterances, but also some sort of, sorry, I heard something, but I didn't understand. Could you repeat?
I guess no one was talking. Yeah, I think you can continue.
Oh, okay. I heard someone speaking. Anyway, so let me continue. But maybe this is a good time to also mention I was told that we are keeping the question answering part for the last half an hour. But if there's any clarification or any question, please interrupt me and ask me any questions you have. But I don't see you, so someone has to shout, please. Okay, so what was I saying? Basically, we can keep our original framework. And the only change that we want to do is to associate some sort of a representation of the perceptual context with every sentence or every utterance that we are feeding to our model, right? So we are talking about some sort of a multimodal input which contains something in addition to linguistic data that the model receives. This scenario is typically referred to as grounded language modeling, meaning the instances of languages that we hear are grounded in some sort of visual or in general perceptual context. Of course, there could be more than visual data that is helpful here, right? The texture, the smell, the interactions, these are all part of the environment and they could all help learning language in various ways. But the classic additional source of information that is usually included in the models, perhaps for practical reasons, but also based on what we know about how human brain works, is the visual context. What can be seen and what is the connection between the observable aspects of the visual context and what the child hears. I hope this is clear now. However, this addition of grounding introduces a new challenge to our model building. And that challenge is evaluating the induced linguistic knowledge. So let's say we want to learn the meanings of words, right? If our ultimate goal was to induce some sort of a lexicon where each word had a correct meaning, then we could come up with some sort of an annotation and some definition of our goal target, and then we could compare the outcome of our model to that target. But now that we are introducing visual meaning representations, right? When we are talking about tupen RNG, and then we see some sort of an orange ball in the corner of the room, and that's the real referent of this phrase, evaluating the knowledge of our model becomes more difficult. So what is the meaning of tup in this case? It's not a symbol anymore. It's some representation of an object which has certain consistent features. For example, it could be, it is almost always a round thing, but the relative size could be different. The color could change from one situation to another. The location of this object with respect to the mainframe might be different. So how do we decide that the meaning that the model learns for each individual word is correct? How do we evaluate whether a model is doing its job correctly or not? So this last step now goes under a big question mark. Evaluating our models becomes less and less trivial, especially as these models become more complicated. A good example is the new deep models of language, which are very, very complex and hard to understand. And so if we are using them for analyzing human behavior, and they usually do a very good job, we have to come up with new and creative ways of analyzing their inner knowledge and their behavior with respect to humans. And right here, I want to go one step further. So when I write sentences and claim that these are the input to our language learning model, I am again doing a major simplification step. Because if you're talking about young children, there's no way their input data has this nice symbolic nature where words are completely identified in advance and separated from each other and immediately recognizable. We are talking about an audio signal where there's a lot of noise. The boundaries between the words are not immediately recognizable. And so the learning process becomes much more complicated in a realistic scenario. But as I said, we want to see how far we can go in, making the experimental setup as naturalistic as possible. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to mainly use examples from speech. So we are talking about spoken utterances or spoken phrases as opposed to the written versions of them. And usually the architectures are more or less the same, but the outcome and the evaluation becomes a little bit more complicated, as you can imagine. All right. So the first question you might ask is, so where do you get the data for training such models? And that's a very good question. I mean, when we are talking about data-driven models and models that are trying to simulate the experience of children, data becomes really the center of the challenge. Luckily, we are, getting our hands on all sorts of data sets these days. And one of the families of data sets that are that have become available and lend themselves very well to this task is image collections with some spoken descriptions, right? So in this case, I showing you an example here. I don't think the audio would play.
A soccer player in blue is chasing after the player in black and white.
Right. So this is an example of the spoken COCO data set where you have pictures of daily activities. So these are not studio pictures. These are regular, real lifestyle pictures. And then these pictures are shown to different human subjects, and they are asked to describe what they see. And typically, the annotators more or less see the same thing in these pictures, but they might use different levels of detail in describing what they see, or they might pay more attention to certain aspects as opposed to the other. For example, if someone knows football, they might try to describe exactly the situation that is happening, whereas someone like me who doesn't know much about football might just describe that there are two main players, there are two people in the background, what the color of their clothes are. But there is an overall some sort of a consistency in terms of the message that they are trying to get across. And this might be a good proxy. This is not exactly the world from the point of view of a child, but it could be seen as some sort of an approximation of the experience of a child when they see things, visual data, and then at the same time they hear some description of these visual scenes. So we can think of these sequences of image, spoken, caption items as training items for our models. Now, how do we process these? I'm not going to focus on a very specific model because there are many around. And my goal is for you to see how we go about trying to simulate this experience and what we learn from them. But I don't want to promote a particular model. However, that said, this architecture that I'm going to show you is very, very common. So the majority of grounded models of written or spoken language use some variation of this architecture. So what happens here is that you have two different modalities. You have images on the one side and you have spoken utterances on the other side. And you pass each of these to a specialized model, right? So you have an image model on the left and you have a speech model on the right. But critically and crucially, each of these models receives the corresponding modality and translates it to a vector representation, which is supposed to contain the description of the content of this item, right? So if you look at the output of your image model, this should be a vector that contains the representation of the meaning of this image, whatever that is. And similarly, the speech model transforms the auditory signal into a vector that is supposed to represent the meaning of this spoken utterance. And once this transformation is complete, you basically join, you project these two representations into a joint semantic space. What do I mean by that? This joint semantic space is something like this, where every point in the space represents a vector that contains some meaning representation, and it might come from a spoken utterance or it might come from an image, but in terms of this space, there is no distinction between these two. However, the ultimate goal of the model is to arrange things and structure this information in a way that sentences and images that happen at the same time are closer to each other. And the sentence that was not heard at the time an image was observed should be far from the representation of that image. So in other words, the green lines should be shortened and the red lines should be as long as possible. This is, I've put the classic training objective up there, which is basically to minimize distance between related items and to maximize distance between unrelated items. And this is, for those of you who are interested, it's called the triple loss objective function. But the details of the function itself is not important. What I hope you get from this is the conceptual idea that you basically want to train your model to project your modalities into a joint space where they are arranged based on the similarity of their semantic content. You can interrupt me if you want any extra explanation or if you want me to give you a bit more detail. No? All right, then I will continue. So surprisingly, I mean, nowadays we are not surprised by anything. Yes, there is a question.
No, I just said there is no question and we can continue.
Oh, all right. I think I hear you with a delay, so I'm sorry if I don't reply immediately. Okay, so these models, as I said, this particular architecture has been implemented with different kinds of image models, different kinds of speech models. We have models that use, recurrent neural networks for example, processing the language part, and convolutional neural networks for processing the image, or any other kind of architecture. More recently, we are talking about transformer architectures, if you are familiar with them. And at the end, the point is that we have seen that this architecture is very powerful in learning similarities and commonalities between the two modalities that we are interested in. So we can, if we have a reasonably sized data set, we can learn to train a model in a way that can recognize the visual counterpart for an incoming spoken utterance or written utterance, or the other way around. It can actually generate or recognize the correct description for an incoming image. And you can imagine that this has actually a lot of applications, right? Every time we, search on Google, for example, for an image of a particular combination of things, and it finds the right answer based on the description that we give it, that we basically are using a system like this. Or from the other side of the story, if you actually use an automatic system for generating captions for images, you're basically using a similar setting. And these are all very useful applications. We are all users of those, I'm sure. But again, in this context that we are discussing them, we are not really as interested in the ultimate performance of this model, although it's important for us to make sure that these models learn the knowledge that we want them to in the first place. But what we really want to know is what they learn. So from this kind of input, excuse me, from this kind of input that we give them, what kind of information they extract in order to perform this ultimate task of matching sentences to images. The problem is these large language models are very powerful, but they're also very hard to understand, as I said. So there are many questions that we might want to ask. We might be interested in what aspects of input these models pay attention to, right? What part of the image, what part of the utterance is most important for the model to do the task that it's trained to do? What kind of knowledge does this model learn? And by this, I mean the intermediate information. What kind of intermediate information does this model need to learn in order to perform its task? we want to know maybe the more detailed information about how this input knowledge is actually processed to generate the output. How does the information flow through the model? So these questions basically take us to this new domain of interpretability. How can we take a model that is performing well, and how can we basically pull it apart and look inside this black box and understand how things work there? This is an ongoing and very active line of research. I can't by any means, address all the complexity of this field today, but I want to give you a few examples just to, give you an idea of the kinds of things that you can do. So one of the, if I go back to the first question, what aspects of input does the model pay attention to? Perhaps the simplest thing that we can do is to apply some sort of a manipulation, systematic manipulation or perturbation or ablation to the input that the model receives. So just to give you a very rough example, let's say that we have a model of the type that I just explained to you. This model receives a sentence and then it retrieves the most appropriate image that corresponds to this sentence, right? So in this example, the sentence is, a baby sits on a bed laughing with a laptop computer open. This is a real example from this MS COCO data set. And if the model is trained well, it will retrieve an image like this, right? Which seems like a very good answer to this given sentence. Now, if you want to know which of the words in the sentence is the most important for finding the corresponding image, one thing you can do is to remove all of these words one by one and then see whether the answer that the model gives you changes. So as an example, if I remove the word baby in this case and come up with a sentence like this, A sits on a bed laughing with a laptop computer open, then you will see that the outcome changes completely. This is the top image now that the model returns, which is not very surprising, but it gives you some idea about which words were the most decisive. So if you come up with some sort of a quantitative measure, for example, you remove a word, then you compare the distance between the final state of the model if you remove the word and if you didn't, and then calculate some sort of a distance between these two final states, you will have an actual quantitative measure of how important a particular word is, right? And you can do a lot of things now. You can categorize these words based on their, for example, syntactic categories or based on other features of these words. And then you can make conclusions. For example, a model like this might pay attention more to, say, nouns and adjectives as opposed to verbs when they analyze a sentence and when they look for the corresponding image, which is not very surprising, but this is some additional information that we get from this kind of analysis. So that might be one way of addressing these questions, but sometimes we want to know a bit more. For example, we want to know what aspects of language does the model encode and where. Does the model encode linguistic form? And where in the architecture of the model is this information encoded? Does the model encode meaning and where? So here, just manipulating the input and looking at the final output is not enough. We want to actually really open this black box. We want to look inside of the model and we want to see where exactly, in which component of the architecture certain information emerges. So one approach that is now very, very popular in the interpretability domain is called probing approach. It has actually a lot of different names because many people came up with this general approach around the same time, and each group gave it their own preferred name. It doesn't matter, but by now this is basically the most common way of analyzing a deep model. And the idea is as follows, that you have you have a model that has many different layers or many different components. And this model is trained to perform task X, let's say. But you have some sort of a hypothesis that in order to perform task X, the model should learn a particular knowledge of type Y in a latent fashion, right? It's not trained explicitly to learn that knowledge, but this knowledge is a requirement for performing the ultimate task. So how do you evaluate this hypothesis? Basically, what you do is you feed your data to the original model, and then you register the intermediate activations in this model. So you, for example, you keep track of all of the activation vectors on layer 2 of this model when you feed all the input items one by one. And then you use these activation vectors as an input to a classifier or a regressor, some simpler model that is supposed to decode the linguistic knowledge of type Y that is interesting to you. If the reasoning here is that if you can actually manage to do that, if you can train a classifier on these intermediate activations that can decode a particular type of knowledge, then this knowledge must have already been learned and encoded by the original model. Otherwise, you could not have done that. So as I said, these are called probing classifiers, probing regressors, auxiliary tasks, diagnostic classifiers, you name it, but all of them follow this kind of logic. So let me give you an example. So the idea, for example, could be that if you want to understand the overall meaning of a sentence in order to retrieve the best image, you have to learn something about the structure of the sentence. Or, for example, you have to learn the identity of individual words, or you have to learn the syntactic category of each word. So you can train a classifier or regressor for any one of these auxiliary tasks that I just named. So the list of auxiliary tasks is really long. It depends on the model that you're trying to analyze. It could go anywhere from predicting the length of the utterance to the presence of specific words in the utterance, different representations of similarity in form or in meaning, detecting homonyms, detecting synonyms, etc., etc. You can be very creative here, actually. So just to make it a little bit more clear for you, I'm going to give a couple of examples of how you set up a task like this. For example, in this model, this grounded speech model that I described to you, the idea is that you are basically trying to understand the meaning of the whole sentence, right? So you're transforming a sentence into a vector representation which contains the meaning of the whole sentence. If the model learns anything about word forms in this process, then it should be able to encode some information about individual words, even when these words mean the same thing. So if you think about two sentences, a girl looking at a photo and a girl looking at a picture, these two sentences practically mean the same thing, right? So it could be that the vector representation of these sentences is actually identical. Of the meaning of these sentences. But if the model actually learns something about the word forms, then it might encode it in its internal representations. And so if you train a classifier on top of these activities, this classifier might actually be able to take a sentence like this and tell you whether the word photo is present here or not, whether the sentence contains the word photo or contains the word picture. So basically, you have to train a binary classifier on every pair of synonyms of this type, and you have to collect in a systematic way data that contains these two synonyms within the same sentence, and then you have to train your classifier. And so if I show you, an example of an analysis of this kind and the model of grounded speech, it kind of looks like this, that what you see is a bunch of lines. Each of these lines corresponds to a separate binary classifier for a separate pair of synonyms. And on the y-axis, you see the error rate of classification. And on the x-axis, you see the locations in this model where we actually extracted the activations from. So we can extract these vectors from the input signal itself, or we can extract it from some convolutional layers, from some recurrent layers, a final attention layer. And what is interesting here is that it seems like the lower layers, the extracted information from the input signal itself doesn't perform very well, even though we kind of expected these identities to be recognizable from the raw input signal itself quite well. But it seems that the model actually really nicely encodes this information about the form of the words, and especially on the lower recurrent layers. As we move towards the higher layers, we lose some of this information. You can do the opposite thing. You can look at the word pairs that sound exactly the same. For example, sweet and sweet, or sale and sale, sale in the sense of selling stuff as opposed to the sale of a boat. These are at the speech level, they are identical. But if you have a sentence like there was a great sale in the supermarket, then your model probably understands, based on the semantic context of this utterance, that the intended version of the word sale was the one that refers to the selling event or the reducing of the prices event. So you can do the same thing. You can train a binary classifier on these word pairs. And now if you do that, and my apologies that now the y-axis is actually not depicting the error rate, but the error reduction rate. It's a relative error reduction, so the higher is the better. Here you see the opposite trends. You see that the lower layers do encode this information, but as you move up in the network, you see better performance, meaning that this information is more strongly encoded in the higher layers. So if we perform a bunch of these kinds of analysis on our multi-layered model of grounded speech, typically an image like this arises, that any task that has something to do with linguistic form seems to be performed best if we actually use the activations from the lower layers. And if we are talking about meaning, which is a much higher level linguistic knowledge, then higher layers, the top layers in the network, seem to be where this knowledge is most strongly encoded. And this is an image that keeps coming up in different papers, different groups, different kinds of tasks. And that's one of those rarities where there is convergence and reproducibility in finding these higher level research findings. All right. Any questions so far? There's silence, so I assume no. Shall I continue? Okay. So one thing that is missing from this simple probing setting, these probing techniques are actually very powerful because they're very easy to implement. But the problem is that in computational linguistics in general and in studies of language, we are more interested in linguistic structure. So parse trees, connections between words within a sentence, whether the subject that usually shows up at the beginning of the sentence and verb that shows later, especially in a language like Farsi, where verbs appear at the end of the sentence, whether the models learn to connect these two together. So
Sorry, Afra,
linguistic,
can you hear me? Oh, okay.
yeah.
We just had a moment of disruption. Now you can continue.
Okay, did you miss some of my?
No.
No,
No, we didn't
I
miss
didn't.
anything. Yeah.
All right, I don't need to repeat anything. Okay, so then I will continue where I was. So as I was saying, in studying language, something that is really appealing to researchers is to what extent the model learns the structure behind every sentence. There are a lot of theories of grammar that make predictions about human behavior when processing sentences, and we really want to know whether these computational models replicate that and whether they need to learn something about the structure in the first place, or whether just information about simple words and their meaning is enough in this scenario. We can, to some extent, address this question using the same simple input perturbation or input manipulation techniques that I already talked to you about. For example, we want to know, we have an input sentence, a brown teddy bear lying on top of a dry grass covered ground. It's a long sentence. And if I give this to my grounded speech model, these are the top two images that the model returns, and both of them seem good choices, right? Both of them contain some brown teddy bear, and there's some grass on one of the pictures, both of the pictures actually. One of them contains dry grass, the other one some green leaves. But anyway, this seems like a reasonable response. Now, someone might ask, so does the model really need the structure of the sentence to understand which image is the best? So if we could do a quick sanity check, we can take the same sentence and try to randomly shuffle or scramble the order of words in this input sentence. If the model only relies on the information that it gets from individual words, then the same sentences, the same images should be returned for this new scrambled version of the sentence, right? But that's not the case, not very surprisingly. If I give this sentence, a of covered laying bare on brown grass, etc., to the model, you see that the images that are returned are completely different. One of them is about brown bear, and the other one is about a field of brown grass. So this already is telling us that something about the structure of the sentence, about the order of words in the sentence, is informative to the model. The model is using this kind of information to do its job. But it doesn't let us really go beyond that. It doesn't let us look at the, for example, parse trees of these sentences, which is something that linguists really like to play with. So these are the kinds of structured representations that we want to be able to trace in the learned knowledge of our model. Now here I actually want to shout out to the neuroscientists in the room, because we actually borrow the technique from computational neuroscience, which is a very useful technique for analyzing these deep language models. And it is called representational similarity analysis. I don't know how many of the people in the room are familiar with this technique, but for those of you who are not, I'm going to explain quickly what the idea here is. So the idea here is that imagine that you have a model of how brain works for a particular task, how images are recognized, for example. And on the other side, you bring human subjects into the lab and you measure their brain activities when you show them a bunch of pictures, right? So you, on the one hand, you have a set of images that you show to human subjects, and then you record their brain activity. On the other hand, you show the same set of images to your computational model, and then you record the activity of the model, right? Now, what RSA does is it basically tells us to build a similarity or dissimilarity matrix based on the same set of stimuli by measuring the distance between every pair of these images or whatever input item we are interested in. And then instead of trying to map these images from one representational space to the other, we basically calculate the correlations between these similarity matrices in each of the representation spaces. So again, let me give you an example in the domain of language. For example, let's say I have a set of sentence pairs or phrase pairs, something like a slice of pizza, a bowl of salad, two dogs run, a kitty running. And on the one hand, I can give each of these sentences to a language model, get some sort of an activation vector or some embedding or representation, and then calculate the distance between these vectors. That would be similarity measure B. And on the other hand, I can show these pairs to humans and ask them to judge how similar they are to each other. And then, give them some instructions. So give me a score between 1 and 10, let's say. And that gives me two sets of numbers. So I have two columns of numbers, and I only need to calculate a simple correlation between these two similarities to see whether in any way my model is doing something similar to human subjects. Right? So basically what I need to apply RSA to language is not a way of projecting from one representational space to another. This is what we did when we did the probing part. What I need is a distance matrix within each representation space. So I need to, for example, if I'm interested in the parse trees behind sentences, if I want to know whether my model has the same kind of syntactic sensitivity as humans do, I need to come up with a measure, a distance measure between two structured representations of two sentences. And then I only need to calculate the correlation between these two spaces. So luckily, we do have these tools. So we have measures like tree kernels in computational linguistics, which take two syntactic trees and then they estimate the similarities between these two trees by, for example, counting their subtrees or different ways of doing it. So you can actually implement this very simply, and this is what I'm showing you is RSA scores, so these correlation scores, apply to different layers of BERT, which is a relatively large language model, not by 2024 standards, but up until like 3 years ago, BERT was very commonly used. And so if you apply this RSA technique on different layers of BERT, you would see that, for example, in the final layers of the model, so this is the large BERT, which has like 25 layers. So you see that layers between like 21, 22, up until 24 encode a lot of syntactic information. Whereas the lower layers don't have that much or as much syntactic information encoded in them. So thanks to computational neuroscientists, we have a very versatile technique to analyze our deep neural models, which can be applied to many different tasks and many different types of linguistic knowledge, but especially the structured types that are of particular interest to linguists. All right. Now, so far I have told you about the attempts within the field on how to simulate learning from raw signals, from spoken utterances and messy representations of the visual scenes, and how we have managed to build models that can be trained to perform this task. But in the meanwhile, in order to perform this task, have shown to learn a lot of intermediate knowledge, which is similar in what we know humans are sensitive to. And we have, in order to analyze these models, developed a set of tools and techniques for looking inside these models and extracting the intermediate latent information that they learn and trying to compare them to what we know about humans processing language. So this seems to be a good place to be, but there is still a lot that is missing. So if I was in the room with you really, and I could see you, I would have asked you to tell me what you think is missing. But since I don't have that immediate connection, I'm gonna, tell you what I think is one of the most important things that are missing. So one thing that you might have also paid attention to is that we are using static images in these models instead of dynamic or moving images. So this is something that is obviously very different from the experience of a child who moves around, touches things, observes contact and change of location and change of substance. The environment also includes a lot of nonverbal cues, such as gestures, nods, gaze, which all have been shown to help children learning language in a more efficient way. Another aspect that is missing from these models is interaction through dialogue. So as I said before, we are basically always thinking, when we build these models, we are thinking about the child as a passive learner, as someone who just sits in the corner of the room and either listens or also observes, but never interferes with the environment, which is really not the case. I mean, again, if you have had ever an experience with a young child, you would know that this can't be farther from truth. So it is important to also take into consideration these kind of feedback and communication strategies that are common between humans and other participants in their immediate environment. And finally, I didn't really talk much about direct comparison with infant behavior, but this should be one of the ultimate goals of these models. We want to know whether the models go through learning phases that are similar to humans, behavioral patterns that we have observed in, empirical settings, etc. I don't know how much time I have. If I have a bit more time, I can talk for another 5 minutes about the first bullet point here and our attempts, but I can also skip it if you think that's better.
Continue.
Sorry, say it again. I missed what.
So you said you can talk for like additional 5 minutes. I think that would be fine. We can hear more from you. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So let me show you a video of a young child. پوشکش کو ماما؟ بیا. اینم پوشک. پوشک. Oh. Pivka. Okay, I better stop here because the conversation continues about the details of this process. But what I hope you noticed is that it's not just one image here that is informative. It's the whole action and the interaction during this action that seems to be giving feedback to the child to learn the right vocabulary for this particular context. So what we really want to do is to move away from these static images and look at videos instead of images. It seems rather straightforward. We basically have to look for data sets that contain videos with some descriptions of what we see in these videos. And there are data sets like that. There are cooking shows, there are how-to videos, there are spoken moments in time where you have a video like this. I don't know if you can hear the sound. No, I don't think the sound is working. Anyway, you have a fragment of a video and then someone explains what's happening in this video. So we can, similar to what we did before, we can try to use these videos instead of static images in our models. The problem in this case, and also in the case of visual, the static images, is that sometimes these videos are not very close to the experience of the child. For example, everything that you hear as a description has a very direct correlation with what is actually happening in the video. And on the other hand, certain things, for example, the voice of the speaker, the background noise, these don't have much correlation with the content of the video. Whereas in the real world, this is not the case. Typically, for example, certain characters, the parents, for example, talk about certain topics much more than a random bypasser. A lot of things happen that are not talked about. A lot of things are spoken about that are not immediately visible. So in real world, we have weaker correlations between visual scenes and the meanings of the utterances. So one thing that we thought might be a good place to start was cartoons, children's cartoons. And so the ones that we used as our first attempt was Peppa Pig cartoons. I don't know if people in the audience know these cartoons. So these are a series of British cartoons that are the visual world is two-dimensional, so the visual aspects are actually very simple, but the conversations are very realistic. So in school, in the house, on the street, with the neighbors, you have conversations that are very realistic, and the constructions or the level of the language is actually close to second language learners' input. There's a lot of analysis, surprisingly, on Peppa Pig cartoons. There are stories. I don't want to take too much time, but it's a very interesting test case. And the reason we chose this was because actually my daughter, who is being raised in a multilingual environment, learned English by watching Peppa Pig. None of the parents were talking English to her. And then we realized that she's learning English because she started talking in British accent back to us, which was very surprising to us because none of us have a British accent. And so I was very curious. This was also in the middle of our research on grounded language learning. And I was very curious, and I looked up and I realized that we were not exceptions. Peppa Pig has been shown to be very effective for children, for very young children, to learn language or even, change their accent. So if when American children watch Peppa Pig, apparently their accent changes to British. Anyway, there's a whole story. But it does have a lot of desirable characteristics in terms of the simplicity of the visuals, but at the same time, the realisticness of the language in these cartoons. And an interesting feature of these cartoons is that a lot of dialogue happens between different characters, which is good. But at the same time, there is a narrator who every now and then comes in and describes what's happening. So we thought that we can, too bad that you can't hear. I don't know why the sound doesn't work. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We thought that what we can do is to use the dialogues as training data and then to use the narrations as tests, because the narrations actually are explaining what's happening. But the dialogues are very similar to what the child actually hears when they interact with their environment. So we basically use the same kind of general architecture, but instead of using static images, now we are using snippets of videos as training data and the corresponding speech signal. And so we basically now have a video encoder and an audio encoder, which we again map into a joint semantic space. And we played with this various experimental conditions. We tried to see what happens if we pre-train this model on video or on audio or both, whether segmentation of these videos has an effect, whether the temporal information has an effect. And I'm not going to get into the details of these. The important thing is that this model works well again. So here you see, recall at n to what extent the best video frame is within the top n retrieved by the model when you give it a spoken utterance. And that's good news. But what we really want to know again is what the model learns about individual words, about specific characteristics. So we thought that maybe we can go back to psycholinguistic experimental paradigms. In this case, we chose this preferential looking paradigm, where this is very old. This is from a paper in 1996, where the child sits on the lap of the parent and looks at two parallel screens that are showing different things at the same time, and then hears a sentence. And depending on whether the sentence matches one of the screens, the child turns their head towards that screen. So that's why it's called preferential looking paradigm. So we thought we can do the same thing here, right? We can have two parallel snippets, and then we play a spoken utterance, and then see which one of these pairs is more natural for the model. In other words, whether the distance between the audience and the correct video is smaller than the distance between the audience, the utterance, and the incorrect video. You can also do it in a more controlled way. You can come up with these minimal pairs. For example, Pippa loves jumping as opposed to George loves jumping. And if you can actually, if the model shows the correct preference, it means that it has learned the word Pippa or the word George, because everything else is similar in these sentences. And so that allows us to actually do analysis on, for example, which nouns are best learned. Here you see a ranked list of nouns. Here you see a ranked list of verbs. And, many other analysis that you can do in a system like this. And now, obviously, we have to move away from cartoons, and we are looking for more realistic data sets that are actually recorded in the child's play environment, and see what happens if we train our models on that kind of data. So finally, something that I didn't talk about is this language and interaction. I'm not going to show you the video because we don't have a lot of time, but the important point here is that interaction is important both from the child's point of view and from the adult's point of view. So children have been shown to be active learners. They actually change the topic. They show preferences for certain topics of conversation, but they're also interactive learners. They respond to certain communication strategies that parents employ, such as correction, recast. They're sensitive to communicative success. And so in the long run, what we really want to do is to also incorporate communicative strategies and nonverbal cues, etc. At the end, I would like to acknowledge the role of my collaborators. There are many of them on these series of studies that I mentioned here, and I would be really happy to take any questions that you might have.
Inspiring talk. So if there are questions, yes.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. A question raised in my mind is that sometimes we have some ambiguous sentences in Persian and English. For example, a very famous sentence is that the wind blew down the chimney. So the question that raised in my mind is that how the system parse the sentence so as the deep structure in the mind of the children is represented, because the surface structure is the same, but the deep structure is totally different. So how can the mother do that? And the second question is that, as you know, as Chomsky raised the idea of poverty of stimuli, as you know, we have motherese, tip of the tongue, and the expression like that. So how can the children recognize the same word at the same time as they know both the correct word and the other word that is pronounced? Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for your questions. I'm not sure if I understood the second question very well, but let me start by the first one and then move to the second one. So you're asking, how do we know how the model parses ambiguous sentences, especially when the implied structure is kind of counterintuitive, right? Am I understanding correctly? I can't be. I don't have a definite answer for you, because, as I said, it's very difficult to get a clean parse tree out of a deep model. Everything is too fuzzy and too messy for us to pinpoint exactly what kind of parse the model came up with. But we can do certain, piecemeal analyses to see what is happening, why we have a particular outcome of the model that is not necessarily what we expected. Something that I didn't mention today, but is again a very active area of research, and actually my own PhD student is working on it, is what is called context mixing. So especially in the context of these transformer-based models, which are very powerful but also very difficult to analyze, something that people want to know is how the representation of a target word is influenced by the context of this word within the same sentence, right? So what is the contribution of other words in the sentence to our interpretation of a target word? And so there are now a bunch of techniques that actually allow us to quantify and visualize the context mixing. So how we actually parse the context and mix these pieces of information together. And we see now a very interesting gradual emergence of these images, these processes, especially for cases where things happen that we didn't expect to happen. But one thing that we can also do in addition is to look at whether this process changes over time. So if you have a model that is supposed to simulate a child, then the behavior of this model should be different if you train it on different amounts of data. So at the earlier stages of learning for the model, when the model is young, so to speak, the model might behave differently than when you train it on a much larger data set, which kind of corresponds to an adult. So that might be a different way of analyzing the models by going through different stages of learning and seeing whether you notice a change in behavior. I hope I addressed the first question. And
my second question was that, as you know, the stimuli is power. I mean, the poverty of a stimuli. For example,
yes,
when you talk to a child, you tell them, for example, dada instead of daddy
Mhm,
or
mhm,
dad,
mhm.
and at the same time they know that father is the same as daddy or dad. So
Right,
the
right.
question is that how they can somehow relate these two concepts to each other, and at the same time they understand the word.
Right. So let me start by this claim of poverty of stimulus. I'm not going to address this because it's a whole, thing, as you know. We can talk about it for hours and hours. But it certainly doesn't apply anymore to the case of large language models. If anything, we actually have too much data. If we want to use these models to replicate the experience of a child, the first thing we have to do is to come up with a way of training these models on much smaller data sets, because we know that children don't have access to that much data set. But one thing that has been shown over and over again is that this issue of poverty was exaggerated. So when you analyze data that children actually do have access to, it is much richer than was assumed by Chomsky and his followers. That aside, we do know, as you mentioned, Mother Ease, we do know that the data that is aimed at children often has certain characteristics that helps children learn language. For example, usually parents and especially mothers use exaggerated intonation, for example, or use simpler sentences, or repeat a lot of things, or use certain communicative success mechanisms, as I mentioned. And there are a lot of analyses, including also a couple of studies in our group on training the models on sentences or language generated by adults when talking to children, as opposed to language generated by the same adults when talking to other adults. And then we see that in certain areas, the child-directed speech is actually much easier to analyze, and it helps learning faster. In terms of ambiguity, context is a major driving force for example, learning different forms, the Dada example that you said. However, again, we know that at least monolingual children are very resistant to learning synonyms. They don't like one-to-many or many-to-one mappings. They like every word to refer to an object and every object to have only one label. This is not the case for multilingual children, but for monolingual children, there is this tendency to not to pay attention to synonyms, but if the context allows for it and forces, then these are all statistical mechanisms, right? So if there is enough evidence, then both children and the models pick up on that.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi.
Concerning the developmental timeline that a child experiences in the senses, the different senses develop in different times, and the sensory provision that a system has, that a model has. How do we rule that out, and what sort of bias does
Mhm.
it?
That's
Thank
a
you.
very good question. Again, it's hard to give a very definite answer to this question. But what we do know, I mean, in general, it's assumed that the vision of humans develops faster than their language skills. We know that children start to play with objects to learn the physics of their environment much earlier than they actually start to speak. There are some counter evidence that children are very sensitive to language data, even, but, way before they start talking, they know a lot about the language that they hear. There are even studies on 3-day-old infants, and they show that they are sensitive to the, for example, phonological structure of the language that they hear. All that said, it seems fair to assume that the image processing part of the story is a bit more advanced than the language learning part. And in the models that we use, this kind of reflects itself by using pre-trained image processing modules. So you have for example, object identification or image processing channel that has already been trained, but then it is paired with a speech processing model that is learning from scratch. We also, in this Peppa Pig experiments, we actually played with it systematically. We saw what happens when we use pre-trained versions of the video encoders and the audio encoders and both. And it seems that for the model, in order for the model to work, it is really important for the video encoder part to be pre-trained. So if you start from scratch on both sides, you usually don't make a lot of progress. But more research is needed. I think what we know is not enough.
Hi, I appreciate your insightful talk. In real world image, we can have multiple things happening in parallel in foreground and in background. I believe the COCO dataset replicates this and have multiple captions for each image explaining different parts. I wonder how this would impact the model learning and the joint representational space.
You're very correct that the same visual space or the same visual scene can be explained at many different levels of detail, right? The rationale behind data collection for some resource such as COCO was that there is no correct answer, right? If there is an image, there isn't a correct caption for this image. There are a lot of possible captions or descriptions. All of them are valid. If I say there are two football players colliding with each other, that's a valid description. But if I also say there are two players, one of them is dressed in blue and one of them is dressed in white, that's also a valid answer. So there is and this applies to real world as well, right? Therefore, it is important for a resource like this to represent a variation in this association between two modalities. And therefore, if you actually provide this kind of variation in the input data that you give to your model, that makes the model more ecologically valid, as opposed to having this very fixed associations that someone decided about, but are not representative of the real world experience. One thing that might be relevant here, now that you mentioned that there are things happening in the background and in the foreground, is that there is now a new series of resources that are becoming available, and these are really eye-opening. And these are data that is collected from cameras mounted on children's heads. So there are these head-mounted cameras that they put on children very, very young as a few months old, and this basically records the world from the point of view of the child. So all of these resources, when we have a camera in the corner of the room and we, have these very messy, noisy images, these are from the point of view of adults. But if you actually look at the world from the point of view of the child, you see a completely different image. What you see is that the child, when they're very young, their point of view is very limited and it changes very little. And most of the time, if they have, say, a toy in their hands, well, they can't walk, they can't crawl. If a 4-month old is just lying on their back and looking at this toy. And so you see this one big object filling their visual field. It's only once they grow a bit older that the world becomes more varied and it starts to change more quickly and becomes more noisy. And so that probably is also a factor, similar to Motherese, that makes the language part easier for children to learn. The visual world might also be much easier to process for younger children because of this.
Thank you for your helpful answer. I actually wanted to follow my question with another on how that we can implement the mechanism of child's attention in our models that you answered that in a way. The mechanism of camera recording the point of view was very interesting.
Yeah, data is one thing. Also, the mechanisms that we implement in our model is another thing, right? So there are many different ways of actually trying to focus on the child's attention. Some of them I didn't get to talk about, but we are actually working on.
Thank you so much for your interesting talk. I have a technical question. You have two separate models for each of the modalities, one for image and another for speech, and then you combine their representation as a joint semantic feature space, I think. Is it possible to use the VLM, visual language model, that combine these two and then extract its internal representation for your analysis?
Can you explain what BLM means? I assume that this is a multimodal model, right?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. So there are a lot of theoretical discussions about, how we actually process a multimodal world. Do we have these separate channels that deal with different kinds of modalities, and then we join them at a later stage, which is what this model that I talked about does? Or we might actually receive all the input in all of its complexity as a concatenation of different sensory motors, and then we pass them through the same processor. There is no definite answer. This is an ongoing debate. It seems like there is some sort of a hierarchical, stepwise way of processing modality, like different modalities, as in your visual modality is kind of in certain aspects separate from your language modality. But we do know that there is massive interaction between these. There are a lot of empirical studies on humans that shows, for example, certain visual features in the environment trigger a retrieval of certain words because there is some similarity in shape. So this is something that is really ongoing work in many different groups, including our group in Tilburg, and it's very hard to disentangle from each other. But it's certainly a valid research methodology, what you described, to have them pass them through the same channel and then try to tear them apart and analyze them separately.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Doctor. I have a question from the language model training. We know that when we are going to train our language from the ground truth labels or captions, a problem that will happen and in most of the models is the catastrophic forgetting. I'd like to know how we can solve this problem while we are training our language model with different captions, especially when in the stage of training, when we perform different tasks against our model. This would cause, in some cases, this problem, catastrophic forgetting. Is this really mm, uh, the place to be concerned about during our training, even in multimodal way? Thank you.
I understand that your question is more of a technical nature, but I will try to relate it to the topic of my talk. So, catastrophic forgetting is a phenomenon that is well known in training neural models, and there's a lot of um, strategies for preventing it or at least controlling it to some extent. You can use different ways of sampling your data. You can try to basically play with your objective function in certain ways. You can play with the architecture of the model. Certain architectures show this kind of side effects in a much stronger way than other architectures. So, depending on your ultimate goal, there are different ways of dealing with this, and it's a problem that you face also in multimodal scenarios. It's not limited to language models, to single modality language models. In the case of simulating human behavior, this is actually, well, maybe as humans we are not very catastrophic when we forget things, but we do forget things, and this is a very important aspect of learning actually. Since we are talking about children, this is important to mention, and it was a little bit surprising to me. I knew that children are also humans and they forget things, but I really didn't know to what extent. So we all know that children are very good learners; they learn very fast, but they also forget very very quickly. And this is really eye-opening. So if you have for example, multilingual child who is exposed to three languages, and they usually, they might be delayed a little bit, but they learn all three languages pretty fluently up to a certain age. But then if you take the same child who is speaking a language fluently and take them away from one of the environments for, say, a year, they completely forget that language, which is really surprising because it doesn't happen to adults to that extent. We do forget things, but not at that scale of completely forgetting a language that we were fluent in. Um, so this seems to have an evolutionary function, actually, this forgetting mechanism, especially at the earlier stages of learning. Once the data becomes more established, the model settles, then forgetting slows down. So if you are interested in cognitive mechanisms in humans, this is not something that you should fight against. This is not something that you have to fiddle with your model to rule out, because I think this is a very natural component of our learning mechanism.
Okay, I think we are almost out of time. I just wanted to ask a very quick question and then we can end the session. Um, so, how about the congenitally blind kids? Do you think language acquisition is completely different in those kids, or?
That's a very good question. So there is a lot of studies on blind children, but also on home signers who are deaf children that are born to speaking adults, and as a result, their parents basically don't speak sign language, and so these children have to basically come up with their own communication system. Um, so, in the case of blind children, it seems that the language learning scenario is not completely different. Even if you just focus on learning the structural aspects of language, they don't even seem to be slower than their seeing counterparts. But of course, the nature of the meaning representations that we learn is different. Was my voice blocked?
Yeah, I think your microphone was off.
Ah, strange. I didn't turn it off. Anyway, I don't know then how much of it you heard. Did you hear my answer at
I
all?
didn't hear maybe the last 30 seconds of
All
your
right.
answer.
Yeah, so what I was saying that blind children do have access to various channels of sensory input, which helps them form these representations. So where normally developing children rely on visual input heavily to build their meaning representations, they basically rely on other sensory input. But then there has been a lot of studies on comparing these semantic representations, and there is noticeable difference. But in terms of the speed of reading, the speed of learning, there isn't much of a difference really.
There is not much
As
what?
far as there isn't much of difference. It's not like blind children learn language in a slower pace.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Very interesting talk. So maybe
Thanks
another.
for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Alishahi. I want to thank you for your great talk. And also, we appreciate that you accepted our invitation. First of all, I wanted to congratulate Women's Day to you. And
Thank you.
I kindly wanted to ask if you have any experience to share or any encouraging comments to all of our fellow young female researchers in the symposium.
I wish you had told me in advance so that I had gathered my thoughts. I feel a bit put on the spot, but I noticed when I was looking at this image next to mine, which shows some blurry version of the audience, and I see that there are many female attendees, and that's very heartwarming to me. I did my bachelor's degree in Sharif and my master's degree in Tehran University, and I was absolutely in the minority. And it's a lot of the problems that this unequal representation of genders provides, you only understand many years later. But then I assumed that this was a problem that was more exaggerated in the environments that I was part of. But when I left the country, I noticed that in many technical universities, the same kinds of challenges exist. I do think that what is really important is to have representations and role models. When you see other people who have gone the same way, it becomes easier to follow. But at the same time, we can't always change our environment. The only thing that we can change is our mindset. And so I hope that this issue of gender and gender roles is not a hurdle, not for our female scientists, not for our male scientists. I hope that we are moving towards structural solutions for the existing problems related to gender, at the same time empowering individuals' mindsets so that they're not disappointed by the obstacles that are in front of us. Best of
Thank
luck to everyone. I really hope that you all continue following your passion.
We all wish you great success in both your life and your profession. Thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you. Same to you. Bye.
Goodbye. Okay, I believe the moment we've all been waiting for